architects can design sound into landscapes as well. And then we're going to finish with Ollie giving us a few minutes about the eco-acoustic guidance that we're going to produce this summer, and then circulate for people to comment on, that sort of thing. So I'm going to shut up and let Ella kick off. Oh, after all that's done, I'm going to talk about the SurveyMonkey questionnaire that hopefully everyone in the room has answered. We've got about 79 responses, and then we've got an hour-ish for discussion, chat, questions, before Mark at the back rounds everything up at 4 o'clock, and we'll finish 4 o'clock, maybe slightly later, for everyone to go home. But that's it. Thank you very much.
So where do I need to stand?
Around there.
Here. Hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this session about our WWF guidelines for passive acoustic monitoring that I co-authored with these lovely people 5 years ago. So we started writing them in 2016. And so Paul from WWF came to Kate, and he was commissioning a series on conservation technology. The idea of these guidelines were really for conservation practitioners who are, looking at how they can survey their particular sites and what the best technology would be to do that. And at the time when we were sort of started writing these, there weren't really any sort of guidelines for acoustic monitoring in general. So people coming to the field for the first time, there was nowhere really for them to go. So those were kind of our core aims for starting and writing this guide, was that it would be a primer for conservation practitioners to determine if passive acoustic monitoring was the best approach. So that that it was becoming an emerging field. There's some really exciting developments in the technology and the software. So people, the interest in it was growing, but again, there wasn't really anywhere for people to go to decide if it really was the best approach. So we wanted to provide some history and background to the field of passive acoustic monitoring. So where did it emerge? Where has it been used? What are the really exciting trends in it at the time in 2016? And where are the opportunities and where are the challenges for passive acoustic monitoring, including what the limitations of passive acoustics are or were and still are in a lot of cases for conservation. One thing that we also really wanted to do is align the terrestrial passive acoustics field with the marine field. So the marine passive acoustics field, particularly for cetaceans, is much more advanced. And so there were a lot of it's sort of terminology, but also methods in terms of trying to estimate abundance from acoustics that had been really well developed and established in the marine field, and we were still quite lagging behind. But we really want to bring these fields together and make sure that we're running in tandem and making sure that we could learn from, in the terrestrial field, what can we learn from the marine field and how can we move the field forward together. As part of the guide, we wanted to provide sort of indications of what the available sensors were, and how you might choose these sensors and what the choices in your software might be, and some just sort of very sort of quite general but some core guidance on how to start thinking about planning a passive acoustic monitoring survey and monitoring program. And just sort of finally, because of the breadth of the field and because we were starting across the whole passive acoustic monitoring field, we never intended these guidelines to be comprehensive. So we sort of end the field with trying to point you towards end the guide with pointing you towards some further readings. So where if you want to do a marine survey, here's some great resources for that. If you're going to do a bat survey, that's where you need to go for that. So I'm just going to do a really quick whistle-stop tour of what we covered in the guide overall. So we sort of started off just thinking about how passive acoustic sensors work, so thinking about sound propagation and basics of sound analysis and how they actually turn that acoustic signal from your target, either organism or environment, and turn that from the recording device, how you then look at it in your sort of analysis software. We sort of think about how it's been used. So, how can it be used in an ecological setting? So, things like estimating occupancy, estimating abundance. How has it been used there? How successful has it been? What are the challenges in trying to actually turn these acoustics signals from the sound in the environment to the actual aim of your study? So if you're trying to understand behavior, is it possible to do that with acoustics? And also thinking about just going between the species, but also the soundscapes. And soundscape and the ecoacoustics was still relatively new and or not so well used, and it's obviously still very much a developing part of passive acoustic monitoring. One thing we really wanted to try and make people think about when you're reading this guide is it really suitable for your objectives? Like, is the system or the study organism that you want to monitor, does it make a sound that you're going to be able to identify? Because if not, then you should stop reading the guide, you go find another thing. Are you going to be able to analyze the data? Will you be able to get that behavioural information? We'll be able to estimate occupancy just from using passive acoustics. And then, yes, again, sort of thinking about guidance on your sensor choice. So we tried to provide a range of what the hardware and software options were at the time. I'm sure we missed some out, but we tried to provide a relatively comprehensive list to try and point people towards the best place, or the sort of what are all the different options. If you're coming to this field, it can be quite overwhelming. And then we sort of tried, we provided some sort of quite broad guidance on best practices. So just thinking about, what are your objectives? Define those quite clearly before you start your survey. Are you doing just trying to do a species inventory, or are you trying to monitor things like spatial changes over time, because that will really impact your survey design? And then planning and how are you going to manage the data that you collect? Yesterday there was talk of all the sort of cloud-based services and how that's really advancing and improving ways to manage all that data. But 5 years ago, a lot of that didn't exist, or it was really challenging to manage these increasingly large acoustic data sets. And then how are you going to analyze that? Do you have the automated classifier? How reliable do you feel that is? Do you have the skills? Do you have the resources to even process all of that data? Because especially when we're dealing with bad data, that's enormous files, and that can quickly become really unwieldy and you collect the data and you can't do anything with it. And then just thinking about designing your survey. So what's your sampling regime going to be? What's your spatial design of your survey, and how does that then relate back to your objectives? How are you going to actually go and then collect the data? So you put your device out, but then how are you going to get it back again? And then how are you going to then, thinking about those data in management and analysis protocols again. You need to test your equipment before you do any deployment to make sure that it is recording the sounds you want it to record. So, if you're doing ultrasonic sounds, will it record ultrasound? Will it survive in the environment that you want to put it in? So, is it going to be weatherproof? Is it going to be insect proof? Things like that. Do some pilot surveys. So this is really important, particularly when you're either monitoring something that's hasn't been monitored with acoustics before, or you're trying to monitor new areas. Pilot surveys can help you decide that survey design. How many survey points, how many detectors are you going to need in a given area to be able to achieve your aims? That also comes back to, I think, one point earlier about power analyses and being able to really detect the changes that you're trying to, if that's the objective of your study. And then some sort of broad sensor deployment considerations. And again, this wasn't designed towards bats, it wasn't designed towards birds or cetaceans. It was trying to help people think about some of the key considerations. So that's thinking about the detection space of your recorder. Where are you going to put it? If you put it under a tree, that's going to affect attenuation of sound, and also how the detection space of your recorder. If you're doing sort of underwater recordings in marine settings, you're going to probably need a boat. You need people who are skilled with deploying things on the water. You might need to do scuba, like if you need to do things underwater, you might need scuba skills. So all of these things then add cost and add complexity to doing these kinds of surveys. So just trying to help people think about all of these different things before you launch into actually going into a passive acoustic survey. Some very broad sort of background on feature analysis. So this is, you've collected your data, then how are you going to analyze it? Some examples from bats. We did have more of a bat focus based on our expertise and the existing knowledge of sound analysis. So things like feature extraction, or can you do some more deep learning methods? And then finally, just some thoughts on conducting your statistical analysis from your data. So I'll just try and finish up now, sorry. So yeah, and just thinking, you know, just thinking about the impact of this. It was 5 years ago. You know, since then, according to ResearchGate, there's been over 16,000 reads. I don't know how many downloads has been, but probably not 16,000. And then sort of the outcome of this was Rory and I then sort of co-authored a paper for methods in ecology and evolution, just really trying to focus the field on what needs to happen now, what do we need to do to bring that, to push it forward. And that's sort of partly, you know, really exciting to see 5 years on from when we started doing this, where the field is now and all of the exciting things that have been happening. So just really finally, just some thoughts on what's needed now. Would it be useful to have an updated list of software and hardware? A lot of those ones that we included have changed, or there's new ones. Would that be useful for conservation practitioners to have a sort of place to go to see what the different options are and how they might be used for their survey? I think there's real need for guidance on how detection distance and microphone decay will affect sensitivity, and those are things that I think are starting to be considered and tested, but I think that that's something that really needs to be understood when you're thinking about actually inferring your when you're then sort of analysing your data. A lot of standardization in terms of data storage protocols, but also collecting these sort of libraries, call libraries and sound libraries for labeling, for training automated classifiers. And we really need some standard methods for doing that and storing them in open access. We really need some gold standard open access test sets that are available to everyone to test these automated classifiers on. And I think that will really help build trust in these methods, particularly in species and things like that, which aren't traditionally monitored with passive acoustics. And just finally, just thinking about how there was some discussion on using historical acoustic data sets, but something that we really need to understand is how we can integrate sort of data collected from these historical data sets using new methods for analysing, and to then really sort of enhance and harness all of that data. I think that's something that's really missing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The guidance is available to download on the WWF website. So if you haven't got a copy, grab a copy and time for one quick question while Pat joins in. No, there isn't. Good. Pat, can we swap presentations for Pat Waring's on the VCT guidance? It is that.
That goes forward.
And backwards, yes. And we'll just get you swapped. Yeah. We are good to go. So Pat's an ecology consultant based in the UK and lots more. I'll let him introduce himself and get out of the way. And as soon as that's up there, and
all at one time to do it every time.
Cool. But does a lot of work training ecologists in bat work
And other stuff.
and other stuff as well.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Hope everybody's okay. Still digesting your lunch. No doubt you're feeling a bit sluggish.
You move a
Bit this way. Goodness me. Okay. Right, this is me, Pat Waring. I'm a consultant. Like Carla said, I do lots of other things: training, teaching, working with people. I'm a massive enthusiast in wildlife sound recording. Member of the Wildlife Sound Recording Society. I use lots of passive acoustic stuff, but to be honest, most consultancy work involves short time scales. So a lot of the time we'll be using other techniques. So you'd just like to find me with a sort of parabolic and other equipment that we'd use, jack, wherever you are, your hydrophones and stuff like that, same kind of thing. So what I should say at this point is, for those of you who've only done PAM sort of work, passive acoustic stuff, don't forget there's other techniques which could open your mind up to all sorts of other things. You'll probably hear 3, 4, 5 more times more stuff using other techniques than you will do with the PAM. So it's something just to bear in mind. Have you considered those other things as part of what you're doing? I'm a massive fan of soundscape recording. I love recording all sorts of different stuff. Curlews, David, I think it was, did a brilliant talk yesterday all about curlews. At the moment, we're working with RSPB, helping their volunteers train up, learning how to recognise alarm calls from curlews and other species when they've got young, for example, to help them do sort of productivity monitoring. And we're working with Queen Mary University of London on sort of biometrics, where we're measuring values of areas using wading birds in this particular instance. But I'm here really to talk to you about the Bat Conservation Trust guidelines for bat surveys. They're on the 3rd edition. You can see just down here at the bottom, 3rd edition at the moment, 4th edition due out at some point. And they take a long time, as Carlos has suggested, with various things, bringing people together. These guidelines can take a very long time to pull together because there's so many different threads, so many different updates, ideas and things like that to bring in from different people. Anyway, the important thing about these guidelines is that they're there. They've actually been published. So we've got a kind of a standard, if you like, or something to actually concentrate on. They're all about bats. No surprise there, really. If you haven't looked at bats, thought about them before, they're pretty fab. They lend themselves to all kinds of different interesting thoughts and analyses and learning about all kinds of funky techniques for going out and doing things and gathering data. But the thing about the guidelines is they're not just about bats, they're about the approach that we can take when we're looking at bats. Forget facts about bats, it could be about anything, right? So the idea is having this guidance, having this structured sort of approach to things is really, really useful. This is Maggie, a friend of mine, who's one of the best bat carers in the country. She looks after injured and orphaned bats. She hates bats flying around her, but she looks after injured and orphaned bats, hundreds every year. Here she is filming some naturalist bats. You can see there's 2 of them down at the bottom of the screen there. They've just been released into a barn after having been sort of beefed up by Maggie, fed up after having been orphaned earlier on in the year. And the important thing is the type of stuff she's doing there, counting the bats, filming them with this infrared camcorder, that sort of stuff is covered by the guidelines too. It's not just about the sort of the gathering of the data, it's about how do we actually go about thinking about what we want. Now, how is all of this about bats? How and why are these guidelines relevant to us? That's an important question, isn't it? Otherwise, Carlos wouldn't have asked me to come and talk about it in the first place. Well, they are very relevant. They're very relevant to the stuff we're doing this afternoon because we're talking about guidance. 2 things to think about, really. 2 things to focus on. Acoustics are a very, very important part of bat surveys and research because these things fly around at night and we get to see them at night or hear them at night mostly. Not always, but mostly. Clearly, using sound is a very important tool. Using our techniques to gather sound and listen to the sounds that they make is very important. Can we just play a quick video clip? Just to illustrate this about bats making sound.
Do we need audio along with this?
Do we need a
Sound.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Otherwise, there'd be no
Yeah.
point playing it. So completely amazing. Someone's speaking to me, confirming something from up high, maybe. Okay, so bats are really cool, right? Like a lot of things, I can't very well show you something about bats and not play any sounds on a conference like this. It'd be ludicrous. So my partner Jeanette, pre-COVID, just in case anyone's thinking, where's the mask and gloves and detergent and all that kind of thing. So the bat conservation guidelines, why are they important for us? We're talking about guidance, right? We're talking about creating some form of guidance or working towards having some form of guidance. Okay, they're important because they provide us with an agreed, structured approach, and they show that this is important in the work that we do. In other words, it kind of confirms this is important. The key word here is legitimacy. Right? Legitimacy, it legitimizes some of the work that we do, and that's very important if you're applying for grants, if you're thinking about going and persuading other people to get involved. But there's one thing that's particularly important in these guidelines. I really want you to think about this, draw your attention to this. The single most important sentence in this 100-page document, which has got all kinds of detail in it, is this. Hang on, no way. Far too exciting. Anyway, an ecologist should use their professional judgment to design the most appropriate survey regime. It's down to an ecologist, the person on the ground, the person doing the work, to design and think about how to do the surveys. The guidance is one thing, the guidelines are one thing, but your own professional experience and judgment is another. The key thing to remember about all of this, if you talk about guidelines at any time, is that the most important part of any guidelines is you and me. not the guidelines. It's you and me, because we're the people who make those ideas. We're creative, we're expressing, sharing information, communicating, working out better ways, refining. But they are useful for some things. They're useful for 4 things in particular. Let me just tell you quickly what those are. They provide a framework for doing something. Well, like a framework makes life a lot easier, but organised. They provide a source of essential reference information about legislation and equipment and things like that. They are, come on, they provide us with prompts and reminders so you don't forget to do things. Because it's easy when it's kind of complicated subject to forget, oh, I forgot to do that one thing, which has changed the whole outcome of this exercise. And they also provide us with a standardised approach, which is great when you're comparing and sharing information with people. Because you can say, well, we did this. Can you see what have you done? Well, okay, somewhere in between, maybe we can work on something. So they're great. They've got lots of really positive things about them. But one thing to bear in mind in terms of what can happen if you have some guidance and you kind of set it down, publish it, and it has certain parameters, certain edges to it, is that you can end up with an awful lot of red tape. And this is a really critical thing to bear in mind right at the start when you're doing any guidance. Someone somewhere is going to treat it as the final word. So you're going to end up with sort of bureaucracy coming into it, red tape, sort of a slavish adherence to something. Very, very well worth thinking about right at the start. It's really so important. That's probably the biggest negative thing about the guidelines. We get bashed over the head with them all the time if we've not followed them completely and utterly, even though it's down to our opinion. So let me just leave you with a few sort of thoughts about this. Like any guidance that you're encouraged to follow, or that you're required maybe to follow, there's 2 really important questions to think about right at the start. First of all, who and what are the guidelines for? Hopefully, for us, it will be back to conservation, or the species, the conservation of whatever species we're involved in, or the habitat, the landscape processes, or whatever. Okay, what are those for? And are we clear about that before we design them? And then the second thing to think about, which is just as important really, is, are these guidelines any good? Nobody ever asks that, do they? We're all a bit, hang on, what do you mean are they any good? We've done them now. No, hang on, right at the start, are they any good? You know, they can suppose, let's just suppose for a minute. Suppose someone was to ask you, when will you know these guidelines have been beneficial and successful? It's a reasonable question for someone to ask you. You've got these guidelines, do they work? Are they any good? I wasn't expecting anyone to ask me that. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Well, you should be, because if you're going to produce them and ask everybody else to use them and adhere to them, maybe start to take them on board. All the young students, for example, you're going to be asked to maybe work within a certain set of parameters. Are they any good? Do they work? That's the bit we most often miss when we're designing things. It's the bit that you should always start with. Someone asked me that. Someone wants to challenge me about that. What on earth am I going to say to them? Carlos, what were you going to say? He doesn't know. I don't know either. I'm just saying we should think about it. Anyway, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Total lack of enthusiasm there from Pat. Well, questions later. It's worth saying that the BCT guidelines are standout in the fact that they have updated them. 4th one just about to come out. We're still using Great Christian New guidelines from 1994. But moving on, we've got Bob, and he's going to save us from PowerPoint and just do a stand-up talk. Thank you very much. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to do this through interpretive dance, but I'll control the program.
Bob, sorry, if you wouldn't mind coming, this microphone is what everyone at home will hear you through.
Okay, you hear me okay now? Hopefully.
Well, we'll see. They'll soon tell us if they can't.
Okay. Right, so my name is Bob Ashington. I work for Natural England. I feel a bit of an imposter, actually, in this afternoon session, so I'm not coming with any guidelines. I'm coming, as you were, as somebody who will hopefully use the guidelines that are generated. So I'm the customer, if you want, the client, or hopefully one of them. I basically work for Natural England, which is the government advisor on nature conservation in England. So we have a finger in lots of different pies. We have fingers in sustainable development, connecting people with nature, with agriculture and fisheries, with maintaining what's called resilient landscapes and seas. So basically looking after our own sites and advising others on how to look after theirs. And we do this in various ways. We run grant schemes, we oversee policy, we do all sorts of things. So We are a many-faceted beast, and I'm hoping that we can utilise the guidelines that are generated in some of those programmes. Now, obviously, I need to deal with one small programme on science and evidence. I help collect evidence to support our nature conservation in its various forms. I mainly work with drones, but in the last few years, having, like Pat, an interest in wildlife sound recording from a young age, I've seen, as we all have, sort of growth bubbling up to the top of ecoacoustics, and it's even caught the attention of us, which is saying something. And because of that, we've had sort of a few things happening in the last few years that all started to sort of coagulate and accumulate to this point where we're at now. So to date, we haven't done a huge amount ourselves with ecoacoustics. We've done more with one offshoot of it, bioacoustics. So we obviously have bat workers, our marine teams have done an awful lot with cetaceans and fish surveying and stuff in the past, but it's never all been joined up. It's never all come together, and it's only now that we're all starting sort of in our different departments to sort of talk to each other. And a colleague of mine, Rory here, is in the agricultural environment scheme sort of element of our work, and they did with Carlos, in fact, they did a sort of horizon scanning of emerging technologies, and one that shows very great promise is ecoacoustics. And that, together with individuals within the organisation doing their own projects and sort of gradually starting to talk to each other, has brought this one as one of the most promising ones that we'd like to work with in the future. We also are generating within our own group a sort of a network of people, an ecoacoustics network. So we will hopefully all have one point of contact, as it were, for the various dissemination of ecoacoustics across the organisation. And of course, being part of DEFRA, we have access to huge databases from other organisations, other sister organisations as well. So we've got a lot of historic data that we could utilise, and I think mine is the phrase that's used to see, you know, where we have been in the past with some of these things. So that's where we are. How do you hope to use ecoacoustics? Well, so for me, the gold standard would be if we could set up a sort of UK A20, the Australian Acoustic Observatory, with a set of monitors out across the country. And we do have a mechanism in place that we could actually utilise, which is the long-term monitoring network. And this is 37 of our NNRs, or protected sites, around the country, where we have for the last about eight or 9 years now have been collating other environmental data. So there are 3 sort of drivers, so air quality and weather and our management, and then indicators such as vegetation type and change, bird surveys, butterflies, and soils. So we've been looking at soil chemistry and change for quite a while, but not the ecoacoustic element of it. And I see that as a natural place for this to sit. So hopefully, you know, we can have an ecoacoustic element, and that will hopefully fill in some of the gaps. As I think it was Kate yesterday was saying about Earth observation, which it's great, but you're looking down, you're not seeing inside. And so we see ecoacoustics as another way of collating or finding information, useful information, that we're just not picking up at the moment. We want to look at on different scales. So we want to look at across the country. We want to look at how things like climate change are causing change in our own sites and the sites that we advise on. But we also want to look small scale as well. So can we use ecoacoustics on a site basis? I come from an NR background. Up until very recently, I used to manage nature reserves most of my life. And we're always asking these questions, you know, are we doing the right thing? You know, do we know there are certain species around? Are they there at a certain time? Do they still exist? You know, is this management practice actually better than the last management practice? So we want answers to those questions, and again, some of us see acoustics as helping with that. We also want to look at the two big questions, which are climate change and habitat quality, and can we utilise ecoacoustics to answer those for us, particularly in the light of things like carbon credits, BNG, and all that, these new policies that are coming in, and the revision to the agri-environment schemes. How can we measure improvements? If someone says they're doing this, how can we actually see whether that's benefited? Does it justify the payments, if you want? So, we're looking at ecoacoustics helping us with that. We're also looking at invasive species. There was some of you may have seen the article in The Guardian last week down to a bird species known as, well, I used to know it as the Peking Robin, but I believe it's called the red-billed Leothrix, is the official name, which I never knew, which is a cage bird, very common cage bird in this country. And they believe there are now populations established in certain parts of this country. And a bit of an alarmist headline, but it was, will this change the dawn chorus in the UK? Because this species in other countries has established itself very well, and because it has a similar ecology to robins, blackbirds, species like that, blackcaps, it's actually starting, it appears, to oust them and to actually become more dominant in those places and displacing the native birds. And obviously that's a thing of concern to us. But likewise, can ecoacoustics help find and track Asian hornet, which is a very difficult species to locate? Could we put recognisers on hives that flag up when an Asian hornet is hanging around? That sort of thing. So there's all these sorts of little tangents off that we're looking into, but certainly INS is a very important thing. And last but not least, public engagement. I think was it Hugh was asking about examples of public being involved. Well, with Jack and Carlos's pond acoustic sampling scheme, I did a little mini project last year. I managed to get some funding to buy some hydrophone and recorder kits, which I sent out to various NNRs for them to obtain data for that scheme. And being very canny in our staff, a lot of them decided, oh, we give this to our volunteers. They'd like to do this. They loved it. I mean, seriously, it was, I've had comments back. One guy said it was the best thing he did all winter. Another guy's gone out and bought himself a whole load of digital recording kit because he loved doing it so much. He now does it himself as a hobby. That's a win, And these are, I mean, I think he was asking about the ageing population of volunteers. Well, yes, we do have an ageing volunteer population, but they love this. They love the tech, and they love the new ideas. They love contributing, possibly in ways that are less physical than the ways they've been contributing normally. Not everyone wants to, smash scrub down all winter when you're 65 plus. So, it gives people the ability to be involved again. And that's a very important aspect of this. It is an accessible technology. You don't have, but that's something I want to bring out. Is that's where the guidelines have to take that into account, because I'll admit I basically took your protocol and rewrote it in a sort of 1 to 10 things, so it could be given to people that hadn't read your paper, hadn't used digital recorders before, and they could set it up and run it. Now I set all the background stuff up, but they literally and all the recordings have come back and they all work. So it worked. So if the guidelines are actually, I don't want to say idiot proof, but if they're good for the layman, because not everyone is a researcher in acoustics, then you'll get so much more back out of it. People won't be intimidated, they'll be willing to take it on, and it will run. Right, so what do we need to get started then as an organisation? An initial clear steer, really. I mean, certainly for myself, we are sort of, practical people. We haven't really come into this from the ecoacoustic research side. So we need to take the best of what you've decided already and to run with it. As I said earlier, things are changing very dramatically. I mean, believe me, just like 15 years of managing sites, I've seen sites change dramatically in just that short time. So we really need to be out there. We really need to be recording now. So if we can get something together that we can use, it may not be perfect, but it's a start. And then we think about, or people relevant, think about how we analyse that later, if that can be done. I've always been told you have to think about how you can analyse it before you do it. I don't know if we have that luxury. or whether enough's been done, enough people have already thought about it, that we can actually get out there and start doing it. Then we need a range of really meaningful analytics at some point in the future so that we can use. Now, with Pat's warning about things being taken as gospel and law, so it'd be interesting to see whether, for things like BNG, whether it ever becomes that. I mean, is there it's semantics, is there a difference between guidelines and a protocol? Are guidelines legal? Is a protocol not legal? Does it matter if you call it something different? You know, it's a way of doing things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a legal precedent of how to do things. Both of these have to be future-proofed in case we do want to use, you know, the data that we've gathered now in 5 years' time and look back to see how we could have done it. And there are lots of big considerations as well. How to store the data, we need guidance on that. I mean, I don't know what the answer to the next bit is. What to keep? Everything. Yes, I knew that's coming back. But you know, when you're a government with a, you know, you're an organisation with a reduced budget, you know, where do you go? And there's all sorts of data protection elements around it. I mean, for all the recordings I've made, I had to put a risk assessment. I had to generate a risk assessment because of data protection regulations. I can't have my recordings being made available to the public and someone's voice being recognised on there. Big no-no. So how do we process this data? You know, do we generate it into a numerical value and store that? You know, or deep vault the originals? It's all things we really need to think about. And just last thing, potential workflows. You know, we do have data scientists, we have analysts and that, and they can run with this sort of thing. I won't even pretend to understand how you guys sort half of this stuff out and do the stats. But someone needs to do it to make it valid. I mean, we are an evidence-led organisation, speaking for ourselves. So, you know, we have to have, you know, it in black and white with a probability score, you know, confidence limits and all the rest of it. So anyway, I hope that's useful. Thank you.
Yeah, we've probably got time. We're going to swap to Asue, who's doing the next talk. Any questions just while we sort that out? Because she needs to Teams in remotely. Any questions for Bob at all? No? Good. Save them for later if you have. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Asue Ruiz-Arana from Newcastle University. She's a landscape architect from there and has produced guidance, as I said before, for the design of landscapes and incorporating sound experiences and design into new environments. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so as Carlos was saying, I'm a landscape architect. I have worked in industry for 20 years before becoming a full-time academic at Newcastle University. And I'm going to talk about this guide to sound. It's a work in progress guide, and the outline won a Landscape Institute Award in 2020. And I'm currently developing it for an upcoming book for Routledge as well. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of why we need a guide as landscape architects and what it covers, focusing mainly on where it links with the purpose of this symposium. Right. So why do we need this guide? Many professions think with their ears. Doctors, for example, train their listening to detect abnormal sounds in the internal organs of patients. But we landscape architects are not trained to listen, despite the role that we play in shaping the soundscape. We mainly consider sound as noise to be mitigated. In the last 60 years, lots of research has been done on environmental sound and soundscapes from a variety of perspectives, many covered in this symposium. And in urban planning and acoustics, this wave of research was triggered by the Environmental Noise Directive of 2002 that recognized the effect that noise has on human health and well-being and required the management of noise pollution and the protection of good environmental soundscapes in the form of quiet areas. The European Commission then produced a technical guide to identify quiet areas that included the Soundscape Approach as a suitable methodology. The Soundscape Approach researches the soundscape first through human perception, adopting a bottom-up approach, and afterwards by acoustic measurement, and is guided by those publications that you see there on the screen, ISO 12913, parts 1, 2, and 3, with more parts currently being developed. But our work as landscape architects is not only concerned with people, we work with and for non-humans too, and as you all know, they listen as well. Currently, key concerns in landscape architecture practice include nature-based solutions that Kate Jones discussed yesterday, health and well-being that Sarah King has also highlighted this morning, also climate and biodiversity resilience, biodiversity net gain, building with nature accreditation, and many more. And I'm showing here UK guidance, but the concerns are shared worldwide. So this guide to sound for landscape architects, therefore, can not only be a human-centered approach to soundscape, it needs to draw from other disciplines, including bioacoustics, ecoacoustics, and also sound art and sound studies to address these concerns. This covers broadly the why of the guide. With regards to what it covers, the guide starts simply by providing advice on how to train our listening. And considering the different roles that listening has for landscape architecture practice, the aim is that by training our listening, we should be incorporating sound into all areas of our practice as opposed to as an add-on. The guide then provides landscape architects with skills to assess existing soundscapes and also to consider sound as an active part of the design process. Also to predict how the soundscapes will be altered through our designs and envisage how users might perceive and be affected by those soundscapes. And acoustic monitoring can input throughout those stages from site survey to monitoring and performance as well. And the guide also points out to other tools available and also when to link with other disciplines as well. And we're currently testing the guide at the Old Pottery in Corbridge. I am working here with research assistant Dan Hill, and we call the pottery our sonic laboratory because we're really experimenting with different approaches, including assessing the soundscape from different perspectives. And you can read more about it in the poster available through the Symposium, and also listen to the sound compositions that we have developed from audio moth recordings. One of the realizations for us from this project from the Old Pottery is that by listening to the audio moth recordings and making the sound compositions, we not only found out the bird species inhabiting the site to inform our landscape design, but we also started to relate to them in a way that we wouldn't have just by reading about them on a phase 1 habitat survey. So briefly, the benefits of thinking with our ears or applying the guide include adding social value through the reduction of noise pollution that has a detrimental effect on humans' health and well-being, and also incorporating positive sounds that are the source of much joy and also conducive to relaxation. Also contributing to sustainability and biodiversity resilience, particularly through the acoustic monitoring of habitats, and finally incrementing design quality overall. So to conclude, some areas for future development, and there are many. So this is just a selection. The first is how to integrate this experiential human-centered approach to assessing the soundscape with more objective acoustic indices and acoustic monitoring. And interdisciplinary collaboration are going to be key for that, and is something that has been touched on this morning as well. Another point is that we care for what we feel, and bringing in the arts and creative practice into acoustic monitoring is going to be also crucial to engage as designers, but also communities with those habitats so that they start to care for them. And finally, landscape management is key for climate and biodiversity resilience, but also for health and well-being. And at the moment, landscape management plans are required for most planning applications. So there's an opportunity to integrate ecoacoustics, bioacoustic methods, also with community and arts approaches to soundscapes to inform these long-term management plans. And with that, I come to an end. Thank Thank you.
But again, saving the question to the panel, and we've got Ollie next to talk about the much vaunted eco-acoustic guidelines we're all waiting for.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Hi, yeah. So I've been quite busy the last couple of days, so not that much time to prepare this. But
Do you have any sound that needs to?
no,
Great.
it's far too complex. So yeah, so myself and Carlos have won a small amount of funding from UKAN, plug for UKAN again, sign up, to develop some guidelines for long-term acoustic monitoring of biodiversity in the UK. And rather than just simply writing them, we thought we'd hold a symposium to get lots of ideas from the UK acoustic community and beyond, so that we can integrate that. And because a set of guidelines that just has one or two people's names on it are not as valuable as if we've got an entire community behind it. And it really feels today, I think I've been really pleased the last few days, it feels like we have the UK acoustic community in this room, online and wider, and support from around the world as well. And it's been really exciting hearing all the ideas and all the thoughts. But we want to keep that going. We don't want to just leave it at that. We want continued involvement in the guidelines as we go through drawing them up. So as has been mentioned, there are already a series of existing guidelines out there, both for acoustic monitoring and for monitoring of the taxa themselves. So you also have things like the guidelines for doing bird surveys, which includes small sections on doing bird surveys with acoustics, but nothing that is quite fills the gap that we've talked about over and over again in the last 2 days, really, that for commercial surveying and for smaller charities, there needs to be maybe in places something a little bit more prescriptive than there has been available before, that sets out what a bare minimum sort of standard is. And in the past, I feel like we've maybe not quite been there, we've not quite had that information, but in some of the places now, maybe we do have enough information to be a little bit more prescriptive in very in the right context. So if you're very context specific, in this case, you do this, you will get X result. And I think this symposium has been brilliant for having lots of fantastic, exciting ideas about how we can analyze data now and going forward. But a lot of that has been quite complex and quite technological. And actually, I think that some of the stuff we can do now just by listening can build on what we're already doing in the field by sending field surveyors out. And we know how to do that stuff. And then there's stuff we can do on top of that with exciting technology. And then there's a whole lot more stuff that we think we'll be able to do sometime soon, but we're not quite there yet. And I think all of that can go into a set of guidelines, especially when we're trying to future-proof stuff, when we're trying to collect baseline data to say, if you collect it like this, you can use it for this now, and you might be able to do this down the line. But if you collect it like that, then you won't be able to do this. I think that's valuable in its own right. So I guess you guys are pretty aware of all this, but my Mendeley didn't copy the citation properly. I think that's 2019. So we've seen a massive increase in passive acoustic monitoring globally. So now is a really good time to start looking at this and start writing guidelines, or not even start writing, increasing what we already have. Sorry, building what we already have from 5 years ago or more recently. And it keeps on increasing. It's sort of like an exponential curve going up. You can see the only reason that one goes down is because monitoring year and publication lag. It's an exponential growth in the use of passive acoustic monitoring around the world. So it's really good to try and capture all of that knowledge. And it feels like actually in the UK, the opportunity is here as well. There's quite a lot of change. Rewilding is absolutely taking off. There seems to be lots of talk about new ways of funding land management, funding farming, biodiversity net gains we mentioned a few times, agri-environment schemes, we mentioned a few times, there seems to be sort of a feel for change, and it's a good time to get some guidelines out there so that they can hopefully get incorporated into these things as we move forward. So if you'd like to be involved in the development of these guidelines, email me. You've all got my email address. But I think hopefully we're going to spend the next hour talking about what's going to be in those guidelines and what it should consist of. I quite like the idea of following the format that we already have done this symposium in. So we start with how you deploy it, how long you deploy it, what you deploy with, and then moving on to sort of species specific and more soundscape approaches. But there's a whole lot of open questions still, even what does long term mean? So my intentions is to watch all of this symposium back and write down all the great ideas we've had, do a pretty big lit review, and then write a first draft of this for sort of mid to late July. But at that point, I think we were thinking of trying to do a sort of a ITBIS process where people will review that in great detail. We'll send it out to anyone that wants to be co-author on it. You can go through, provide loads of comments. We've promised UKAN that it will be available for their thingy in early September, but it might be a second draft by that stage. So we're aiming for getting this done over the summer. And we really want involvement from everyone. And that doesn't just mean the acoustic experts. We want involvement if you're a consultant in the room or online that wants to use acoustics down the line, but you haven't used them before. We want that input. If you're from a charity that's interested in using acoustics, we want that input. We want as broad an input as possible from everyone. Thank you very much.
Fab, great. We're going to have a panel discussion in a few minutes. So if the speakers could come down the front, and while that happens, I've got the UKAN questionnaire presentation, which should be on there as well. And so for the last couple of weeks, I've had a SurveyMonkey questionnaire that's been doing the rounds in the ether and had about 80 responses to that. If you've not filled it in, it is still open and we're still interested in views. So please go onto the link, which is in various places. It's been emailed to you. It's on Slack or check my Twitter feed. And I asked a numpty question, really, that if you are wanting to do a general eco-acoustic survey of an area of land, nature reserve, small bit of landscape, and you've got about half a dozen acoustic recorders available, how would you set them up and deploy them in the field? Yeah, what settings would you put on the recorders and how long would you have them out for? And these are the answers. If somebody's, can I press go on here? Yes, so 79 responses so far. The first question was, what sample rate would you recommend for an eco-acoustic? So I specifically asked, not bats, yeah, because that's a whole different ball game, really, and pretty good responses in terms of 44 or 48 kilohertz. So yeah, gives us the whole range of human hearing plus a little bit on top, and we'll pick up some bats, actually, nocturnes and stuff you'd pick up as well. So seems to be pretty good agreement on that for an eco-acoustic study in terms of what sample rate we should use. Next question was, how long should we record each WAV file for, presuming we're using WAV files? And yeah, not quite so much agreement on that one, but 1 minute and 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, is probably a good thing to go for. If you record longer things, you can always subsample, can't you? But a lot of people and a lot of studies for eco-acoustic studies, when they're using acoustic indices, have used 1 minute, and it's maybe developing into a standard. Some people don't know. Yeah, I don't know. And some people have gone for longer recordings in terms of each WAV file. That integrates with how many WAV files do we want per hour, and obviously these two are related. I need to do the stats on this to see what the correlation's like. But something like 6 or 12 files per hour. If they're 5 minutes long and there's 12 of them, yeah, that's constant recording. So stupid question, gets stupid answers. But it might not be that. So I need to, again, yeah, 20 lots of, yes, 6 minutes or whatever, 10 lots of 6 minutes would do the same. So it'd be interesting to see whether people think that subsampling or time sampling or full on 24 hours a day, yeah, 60 minutes an hour is needed. Come back to you on that one. But pretty much everybody agreed that full 24-hour cycle is useful for recording. If you read Ollie's paper, it might not be that useful in terms of actually analysing all your data within 24 hours, and you might want to focus on particular time events. But if you're recording to the full 24-hour cycle, then you can subsample yourself and do that later. There are some bat people who didn't read the question right and put the and stuff like that. But yeah, 24-hour cycle, why not? Tricky question next. How long do you have a recorder in the field for? And some people made some valid points. It depends on how far you have to drive to go and do it and how long the batteries last and practical things like that. But maybe a week or 2 weeks or something like that for a single deployment is probably a good set of data. Nobody went for less than 1 week, really. And some people, yeah, greater than 1 season, have a single deployment that lasts the whole year. Yeah, good luck with the batteries on that one. So 1 or 2 weeks, maybe, and maybe 4 times a year, cover the whole yearly cycle, perhaps. So yeah, winter, spring, summer, and autumn is the other season, isn't it? If you wanted to deploy it, that sort of thing, but picking up stuff year round and getting a reasonably decent data set for a site. Again, lots of variation in answers there. And then how would you record, or where you place the recorders? I've used grids or subsample grids, stratified grids system in some of my studies, but most people think actually pick the places where they're going to go. And maybe that's not such a daft idea. Yeah. If you read Covarrubias' paper on selecting optimized locations, that's a good one to have a look at. And then how far do you separate them? For some studies, you want to have the recorders close together. If you're doing time of arrival stuff, as Becky was talking about earlier, you need those sound spheres to overlap, really. But if you want independent data where you're not getting spatial autocorrelation and all those sorts of things, then you need them probably at least 250 meters apart if you're recording birds, or maybe 500, or maybe a bit wider. But yeah, 4 recorders per kilometre squared, that's probably affordable for most studies, isn't it? I think maybe, especially if you're moving them around, as people think you might want to do in the purple line there. So next question. Do you put the recorders in the same place every time you deploy? If you're deploying 4 times a year on the same spot, is probably beneficial, unless you need to cover a really big area and you want to cycle your recorders around the site, in which case maybe different locations is okay. And that is the results from that numpty survey, as I said, which takes in no issues in terms of how you want to deploy on your site or that sort of thing, but interesting information. And no, that's it, I think.
You want to put up Slack, right?
For later,
Okay.
But if we can get that ready, that'd be good. So, so I didn't really allow much time for questions before, but we have the panel here once Ollie comes back and sits down. So in terms of guidance and stuff like that, has anybody got any questions? Or otherwise I can kick off with my question. Sarab.
So we talked a lot about like standardizing surveys and stuff.
Yeah.
Integrated with this, so you have like technical standards system. Like, you know, is that within the remit? I think, or is that?
I'll let Ollie talk in a minute. My view is that the most important thing to try and establish is data collection process and try and get some, not standardization, but some guidance that helps people who don't want to do something specific to allow them to gather data properly. Then there's a whole range of other stuff in terms of metadata and storage and archiving and analysis processes, which I'll let Ollie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think we absolutely want to include that sort of stuff, and I think it's something that Ed Baker's maybe been working on quite a lot, and I'd quite like to incorporate some of the stuff he's done. That sort of world of orthoptera seem to have made better progress with those sort of standards for metadata than perhaps the bird side of things has. I think that's maybe because birding has Xenocanto and Macaulay Library, which are so amazing but so dominant that people haven't really thought beyond, okay, I'll stick it on Xeno or Macaulay. So I think actually for data that's not intended to be going up and shared as part of a sort of a citizen science sort of thing, that's commercial or semi-commercial or something like that. You know, as we're talking about like a history archive, I think it's really important to get the metadata right.
Like give like a little 30-second project
Do it. Come up and stand in front of the mic then.
Wizard. Space for you there, Sarah.
It's like I don't know lots about it.
So everyone at home, Sarah, gonna come and chip in.
Ed can't make it. He's
He put on Slack that he's got another meeting. Is that
yeah.
what
So
you're
that's all. Yeah. So he was messaging me. So he can't make it right now. He's got another meeting, but he's running this project called Audioblast, where he's working with I think Alice, you'll know Audubon thing.
Yeah.
Like, so there's like some standards for how to like label your metadata and integrate it into files. But his idea is create, and he works between York University and Natural History Museum. I think he's fully moving Natural History Museum soon. And to make this massive audio library where anyone can upload their data and it's analyzed with standard algorithms, right? Anything that's open, he can implement. But then the way the detections are stored and everything will be standardized, and it'll be stored in like the museums, like archives and vaults, proper long-term data storage way. And I think it'll sort of open up really cool opportunities for like massive, like, I don't know if meta-analysis is the right word because you've actually got the primary data there, right? But like integrated analyses around different things. And because right now, I mean, I've got like 5 different data sets, but all of them are labeled differently. And I wish I could just press a button and get like an answer. But he's kind of doing the hard graft computational infrastructure work. And I think there's good support and funding coming from the museum to support this and other external partners that will be announced whenever it's announced. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there are good reasons for consultancies and that sort of thing to want to keep their data confidential and not necessarily upload it to an open source platform. But I still think you can still have a uniform way of collecting the metadata so that if it does find its way into repositories down the line after projects have been completed or whatever, or if you want to just do comparisons, then that data is standardized and there.
One way potentially to get around that is to put embargo dates on data. So if consultants are uploading data, they could just say, yeah, make this freely available 2 years down the line or whatever, once a planning application or whatever's gone through, and rather than waiting for them, having to make them wait to upload stuff, which I won't do later down the line.
Do we want to try with microphones just to see if people can hear online with the in-room microphones?
It worked earlier.
Okay, let's try because Paul's going to ask a question.
So second question for Paul.
Well, it's going on from metadata as well. So in the bat world, there is an international standard for putting metadata within a WAV file, which is at the name Guano, as it would be, which it stands for the Grand Unified Autonomous Notation Ontology, I think, Acoustic Notation Ontology. So there is an actual standard there, which I think a lot of people that create audio recorders as well also follow the same sort of standard. So it basically means it produces a table and all the bits are in the right place, so you can hopefully just extract it. So it may be worth contacting Guano. It's an independent thing, and seeing if we can maybe fill in some gaps, maybe speak to them to say we want to do one for Acoustics as well. Let them do the hard work.
I think Ed is, fully aware of Guano, I think, and is doing work to integrate that with Audubon.
I've already noticed discussing with Ed. So we've got the bug platform, we've got like tens of thousands of hours of data there. And because it was built by software engineers, there's like all the metadata there and properly stored and everything. And writing the adapter between that to his Audioblast thing is like a pretty couple days job, right? But the point is that whichever standard you follow, like Guano is like well documented, like how to do it, right? And whether Audubon is a different standard. So like not everyone necessarily needs to like use the same standard, but people need to use good standards, whichever one they pick, not just
a standard.
Yeah, not just like naming a file name like this because it just came to me like that.
Whilst you have the mics out, do you want to talk briefly about anonymizing data? Returning to the Sarah session.
Get down the front again.
So again, in Norway, we're doing nationwide monitoring, and there's like real concerns about data privacy. So the way we get around it right now is we get landowner permission to put things out, but we'd like to be able to anonymize our data. And there's we've authored a paper, it's on bioRxiv, on using machine learning algorithms to detect the speech. Long story short, the off-the-shelf ones, cutting edge, whatever, okay, not great. You can make your own by recording your own soundscape and augmenting human data onto it, and so you make something more specific. We think it works quite well. having said that, when we've also applied, we're looking at precisions like 20 or 30%. So that still means that if you enforce strict anonymization using these cutting edge, the best we can possibly do, you're still getting rid of 70% of the things that aren't human speech. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I don't know how the A2O people, like the Australian Acoustic Observatory, are getting around it, but doing nationwide large scale monitoring, which is like really, I'm really interested in doing these like large long term things. I don't think you can ignore it, but it doesn't seem to have been addressed in the literature much before. So, yeah.
If you're in the middle of the desert in Australia, probably not too many people knocking about.
I think, and I might be wrong on this, but I think A2O turn it all into indices and then store it as long-term false colour spectrograms. Right. I might have got that wrong, but that was my impression.
Cool. Yeah. Any more? Yeah. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll fire one out. And it was sort of something that Ollie alluded to, and just whether we think to the panel that the sort of the research and the practice is sufficiently well developed now to actually produce good quality ecoacoustic guidelines that have legitimacy and use.
Panel, do you want to come in? The people at home would like to see you. They've seen Carlos's beautiful face, but they might like to see you as well. Go on, come in close to your friends.
And whether there's any answers from the people who aren't in the panel on that, be interested here. But and is it worth talking about some of the improvements to the 4th edition of the BCT guidance, for example, where they're looking to incorporate much more evidence base?
I'm not sure how relevant that will be for everybody here, but I think one of the important things to bear in mind is that it's perhaps not so much do we know enough, it's what we've learned from the other guidance to tell us what we might try and avoid or what we might improve, how we might open the doors up a little bit wider, and how we might seek help from and collaboration from people who are not necessarily the first people you might think about. We'd have never thought with the back guidance to talk to engineers, for example, or to come and talk to software developers. But that's clearly something very important that we've spent the last couple of days talking about. And we might not have thought about talking to other species group specialists. And again, would make an awful lot of sense. We probably wouldn't have thought of talking to people who were dealing with orthopterans, for example, or cetaceans. Clearly, there's all these different levels of development going on in different places that overlap sufficiently for us all to gain something by that extra bit of collaboration.
Anything to add?
I was just going to say, I think there's possibilities for having these standard guidelines, but I think with a lot of this is still under development, and particularly trying to use one standard approach to monitor lots of different species. So, a lot of the time we do very targeted monitoring, and, for bats we have we know roughly, when we do a 1 minute in every 5 minutes, what we're going to get in terms of number of calls and things like that. But then how would that translate to a species that doesn't perhaps call as often as a bat? So species that have different call rates. And I think that's something, a big gap still is understanding how call rates will affect the outcomes of your survey in terms of what you actually detect and what your ultimate inference is in terms of occupancy or abundance and things like that. And I think doing these multi-species surveys is still something under development and still something that perhaps just not is impossible, just needs perhaps a bit more exploration in actually defining what those guidelines are. And I mean, in some ways doing 24 hours continuous monitoring gets around all of that, because it doesn't matter about call rates then, because you're probably going to get everything within a certain amount of time. But if you're trying to think about what that advantage is, the spatial design is, I think there's still some gaps in the knowledge and trying to in being able to produce guidelines which are going to be useful for practitioners or Natural England in gathering the information that you want.
So I was going to say, there's also this has been very terrestrial based. I know there's a big call within an organisation for an equivalent set of marine guidelines, and in fact, in some ways, they're actually not in that respect, but they're ahead of us, and they have lots of historic data and access the vast amounts of data that exists already. But other than sort of BSISOs for sort of marine industries around hull driving and ship noise and that kind of thing, there's no real. I think there's one actually being developed now for ambient noise levels, but there's no real guidelines for them either. And that's obviously beyond this particular conference today, but it's something I think needs to be also considered, and whether a subgroup can meet or another round of experts are collected to do that as well. And also the guidelines, I think, have to also fall within the constraints of the equipment that most of us can use and afford as well.
So if you get to some other places in the marine environment, for example, in Germany, if you're doing assessments there, it's absolutely spec'd to the nth degree, including what equipment you need to use. It has to be a sea pod, and you have to do this and do that and report it within 48 hours, etc., etc. So, but we've not got that in this country yet.
Yeah, it's an area I don't know that much about, to be honest, not being in the marine team, but there are people that contact me within an organisation. They're saying that, where can we go with this? There are MPAs and other sites that want to designate, and we need to be able to monitor what's under the waves as much as we can of what's above them.
Cool.
I'm glad Bob's done, because I'd like to make a suggestion. My name's David Waddington from the University of Salford. You may have seen our poster. It's called Habitats, and we're interested in sustainable development. And we're actually looking for you to give us some tools. Now, it's not just me. Rob's up there from the Environment Bank. We want to get the job done. And at the moment, there's a distance between where this community is and where we need you to be. Here's my suggestion, that you put together best practice guidance. And the thing about best practice is, it's not necessarily good practice, but it's the best that we've got, because we need to move on with other developments. So maybe you should be talking about best practice and sharing best practice, which is what you've got in current guidelines. That's my suggestion. Would that, Bob, help what you need to do? If you had best practice, if we've agreed this is the best that we've got, we're going to get on with it.
It probably would in some aspects of the work that we do. I'm not sure it would be useful across all aspects, but I know one of our areas of work is sustainable development. I'm sure they'd welcome something along those lines. Particularly with the growing, thank you. Sorry, particularly with the growing importance of BNG and carbon credits and such like. Yes, it would be, particularly along those lines. But again, I don't know if that's a silver bullet.
Oh, it's not a silver bullet. It's exactly as Pat was saying. We have the potential for creating a club for people to beat us over the head with. But that's why we call it best practice. And I acknowledge that it's not necessarily good practice, but there are other urgent things that need to be delivered. And if we don't start to deliver it, then it's just going to become a bit of a mess. Some consultants are going to do one thing, others are going to do another. And the only people that will benefit will be the lawyers. The reason we are here is because the work that we're doing with industry has led us to people asking, well, what is the impact on wildlife? And we're standing there going, don't know, don't even know who to ask. And then I asked the Environment Agency and they don't know. And they asked DEFRA and DEFRA, they don't know. Now we're getting to a point where everyone's standing in a room going, do you know? Do you know? I don't know. No, I don't know. So maybe that's what your UKAN initiative can be, to say, this is the best practice at the moment, and at the bottom of that has got to be a whole list of further work. Now, I'm going to set that someone from university, and we always want to do more research, but that further work needs to recognise the limitations that we've got and say these are the holes that need filling going forward. But for now, best practice, not necessarily good practice.
Sounds like wise advice.
Exactly. And just to fill in on the BCT guidance, I think the Bat Conservation Trust Survey guidance, as we've been talking about, is on its third. The third edition came out in 2016, and we're waiting the fourth edition, and that has been best guess practice for the last few years, because if you read that, there's currently about half a dozen references in there that support these survey recommendations that say you need, if you're doing the habitat assessment for bats, you need
class it as low, medium or high, and that determines whether you do, you know, 3 seasons worth of 3 nights recording, or whether you do 12 visits with 5 nights of recording, etc. And that's based on nothing apart from experience that workers put suggestions out there in terms of what they think is appropriate. The 4th edition is going to rewrite the book, hopefully, and make sure that the science background that has studied survey methods is actually incorporated into the new guidance and make it much more robust, defensible and whatever. But we've been coping with, you know, the best guess practice for more than 10 years. So it works, it allows consultants and others to do their job consistently across different projects and that sort of thing. And it's never the one single answer that can't be improved in the future.
Just quickly, James, we need to get some people.
The most important thing in that guidance is what Pat put on that screen. And if you know anything about BS4 and 4.2 and the people around here that have heard about this and use it every day in consultancy, it is you've got to use your professional judgment. It's not a definitive, you can give it to a robot and it will work. You've got to come along, you've got to be practical in what you're doing, pragmatic in what you deliver. You've got to use your professional judgment.
Do you want to go, Alice? Do you want to?
Yeah, this was a comment from Lydia Katsis online, moving slightly, broadening out. So she says, I feel it's very possible to generate best practice in guidelines. She said good guidelines, but it's a good point, on data collection itself. But in terms of analysis and computational needs, I'm not sure how this would be integrated. Let's not use these words up these speakers.
Yes.
Ollie, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess. I was thinking about the microphones. Yeah, I think that's again what I was saying with some of the up and coming technology that's still not quite resolved. And I think for Acoustic Institute, that's certainly true. But I think for some of the analysis, I think just putting down in paper, in best practice guidelines, things like when you do a point count, do 1-minute surveys or 15-second surveys rather than 15-minute surveys is useful. And that, you know, there is a meta-analysis out there that shows you get 11% more species using passive acoustic monitoring than in practice, which I know is just talking about my own stuff again. But I think some of the stuff that's quite simple analysis, the evidence base is there for. Sort of Carl's stuff and Capicani, you know, you can say for individual species, you can use effective passive acoustic monitoring tailored for individual species. You have to have ecological knowledge, of course. You have to tailor it. We can't tell you exactly how to do it, but we can say there is evidence that passive acoustic monitoring has been effective in this sort of scenario, which I think is valuable. I don't work in consultancy anymore. I only did for a short while. I was mostly in the field, but to me, I think that would be valuable for that sort of thing and for wildlife trusts and for other people. But tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay, so one thing to consider, for everybody to consider, particularly people who are coming into the field who've maybe not got a huge amount of experience, or perhaps you've come into it and the systems that you're asked to use are quite standardised already, is are you sure that what you're choosing to do and the techniques you're choosing are the most appropriate? Have you already consideration? So you just take one example. Ollie's just talked about doing bird surveys and sampling every so often.
Just talk about
Okay, I can do that, thank you. So Ollie, as I said before, was talking about bird surveys and what you'd actually use and how you'd sample, and that's fine. That's one approach. That's not a standard approach for everything, because for some approaches, if you're there for a few hours and that's all the time you've got, and sometimes it is all the time you've got, it's no good setting out some passive acoustic monitoring equipment. Clearly, you'd have to adopt a different approach. You might carry around a small recorder with you at the time, or you might set something at the start of the survey and collect it in at the end. And because we're talking about a very broad audience here, potentially of users, from volunteers through consultants and people studying in academia, and a wide range of other people who we might hope to collaborate with and include within this guidance and encourage them to use it so that we all learn something from it, you might well find that a lot of those people may feel that they're having to throw away some of that potential usability or some of those techniques because the guidance sort of focuses on certain things in particular. Now, I'm not saying there's a danger of that, because that's what we're here talking about now, so clearly we're considering it. But to start by saying that, for example, passive acoustic monitoring is the answer to everything, would be quite incorrect, wouldn't it? But clearly, because a lot of us, particularly in consultancy, for example, with the volunteers, may be involved over a very short time period. So we need to accommodate that the need may be much more wide and much more specific sometimes, actually, than just saying that we'd put some machines out. And what I said before, I stand by, which is that the construction of the long-term devices that we might put out in the field is often very robust, waterproof machines that will last for a long time. It can be powered, very, very low power, but the ability of you to gather data using the microphones in them can be very limited compared to some other technology. And it's very well worth bearing that in mind. It might come as a surprise to some of you, but if you haven't compared the two, it can be a real ear opener, an eye opener, an ear opener, just to consider that, what the difference actually is. It's a bit like the difference between literally going outside here, listening to the birds with your ears, and getting the cheapest dictaphone and plugging some headphones into it and putting them in, and you'll hear so much more. And it can be a big surprise, and it can really change your mind about how you approach something. Just something to bear in mind.
I actually have a question, sort of maybe kind of following along those lines, because we've talked a couple of times in the last couple of days about making sure you test your equipment and things. I'm wondering if it's worth sort of defining a set of guidelines for like a startup calibration when you go out to do this kind of, like, to say, okay, here's a little app on your phone, go stand 3 meters away from your microphone, play this, move 2 meters to the left, 2 meters to the right, play this back, and then you have some sort of startup recording thing that then you can sort of go back to afterwards and say, okay, what did that sound like to my setup, and can be kind of used as a
frequency sweep.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, or even to, I mean, it might even go as far as recommending, record a full 24 hours nonstop, and then you can sort of start the rest of your protocol after that. But
your CIE protocol's got something from that, hasn't it?
Yes, so maintenance calibration, checking the quality of microphones and stuff is something that noise, sound consultants are well used to. And in the marine environment, checking the quality of hydrophones before they're dropped into the ocean for 6 months needs to be done. And the National Physical Lab and other places have test tanks and that sort of thing where units can be sent for. Within the bat consultancy world and eventually the bird consultancy world, yeah, no one knows anything about that really, and no one really tests their kit, and they just assume that they get the bat detector off, the 5-year-old bat detector off the shelf at the start of the season, put it out in the field, and all is hunky-dory. And if asked, bat consultants what a piston phone was, yeah, no one would know because no one's ever used one and don't know what it does. So even having a short section in guidance that says, yeah, maybe think about, testing your kit at the start of the season, and this is how you could potentially do it, either just by, we used to, point them at a cathode ray tube television, which produced sound at about 40 kilohertz, and you could tune your heterodyne bat detectors 20 years ago to do that when we had big TVs rather than flat screens, to test that actually the sensitivity and the frequency response on bat detectors was suitable. Can't do that anymore, but there are other methods available in terms of having ultrasonic bleepers or using piston phones if you've got the right sort of microphone to fit that, put a pressurized air into the microphone and can test that they're actually working and the response is what you expect. And if it doesn't work like that, then you throw it away and you buy a new microphone or a new audio moth or whatever else it might be, because the data you're going to get in is not going to be consistent between different units and whatever else. So any recognition of that within guidance, just flagging it up, ooh, maybe think about this, is definitely worth doing. So we will definitely do that. And Sarab's got his hand up and Ollie's got his hand up to chip in on this as well.
Well, I was just going to slightly build on what you were saying and saying that over the last 2 days, I've been increasingly thinking that actually for long-term acoustic monitoring, sort of like 5 to 10 years, this sounds like it's the biggest outstanding problem left, how you compare data that's collected with a microphone that's slowly degraded over 2 or 3 years, and then put in a new microphone, because you might not even be able to buy the hardware that you started with 5 years ago, replace that, how we can make that data comparable. And we don't know the answer to that. But I don't think that's a reason to not start collecting data, but we do need to start working on the answer to it. Someone volunteer.
I was just going to say, I think we also really need to develop standards for testing these, like the microphone sensitivity and how that decays over time, but also how detection space is affected over time in different environments, because not only like the change in the microphone from device to device, but also over time, but also how that detection space is going to affect how you can compare recordings from different years, but also from different data sets and things like that. We really don't, I think that's a huge gap as well still.
Exactly. Sarah.
I was just going to say the noise consultant type people who do this are very expensive equipment. It's not like, you know, you can't do it with a phone. You could just about do it with a commercial speaker if you have the right calibration equipment. Like it's like, it's cool. I agree, it should be done, but it's not as trivial as just like getting a phone and doing it in this 5-minute like quick setup. Like, let's say this, and also I also just like it came to my head that maybe this is something we should build into our hardware, right? Like I don't know who's here who are building the hardware, but
It's built in.
is it?
Yeah.
So what you have like a speaker?
It's built into the
Okay.
system. So, but it's kind of like it's above a threshold. So you go, oh, sorry. So it's kind of like above a threshold. It works this point. And if it goes below that, you take the microphone out straight away, put a new microphone in. So it's not you don't throw the whole box away. You just throw in that little like bit away.
If you have a detachable microphone.
If you have a detachable microphone, if you can hit it with a hammer. But the word calibration, really, in this sort of sense, isn't really calibration. It's either it's working to a point or it's not working. And I think that's probably the thing. Sort of the word calibration means you can tweak it, and you can't at the moment. No. Whereas the guys that you're talking about, they can. They have this like horrifically expensive equipment that they go out to monitor sort of ambient noise and things like that.
But yeah, I mean, for
guys, just like a quick word on that.
Yeah.
I'm one of those guys. The University of Salford have a calibration laboratory, and we're about to become the designated institute for that sort of thing. It is indeed calibration that we do in the Cal lab, and it costs you about 300 quid to get your sound level to calibrate, and it has to be done every 2 years. And your calibrator that they talk about, that you use in the field, that's actually a verification of the instrument chain, 94 dB. On the calibrator. Now, it's not actually a calibration. You're just verifying the instrument chain. And as you say, if it's not right within a dB, you just can't do your measurements. And as we said, that costs more than your entire device.
Yeah.
And they're just not practicable to do the kinds of things that you do. So you've got to have something quite different. It could be a different standard that you're using. And that long-term method of doing it, which is an electroacoustic method, might be the way forward.
Not this device, this device is 3 times that.
That might be the price, yeah.
As acoustic ecologists, are you able now after years, years of listening to wildlife, do you get to like listen to a sonogram? Say, well, I know what that is. That's about. That's what species about. Just your sort of psychic development of.
Yes, well, back in the day, that's what you had to do because we didn't have the means to digitally record it, and you were listening to the signal transformed into human hearing, and so people, old geezers like us, used to have to spend 2 years learning what a Dorbenton's bat sounded like compared to a nocturnal bat, and as you were twiddling the dial on your heterodyne to try and tune into the right thing. These days, we use a combination of listening to the sounds and the use of spectrograms on screen, obviously, and you can use the visual and the auditory signals to classify species as a human. Yeah.
I do about 95% of mine visually rather than hearing.
Yeah.
Having to refer to it.
It's just much faster. You can just flick through like sound file after sound file after sound file, just looking for the signals I'm looking for and listening.
Exactly. So Paul, he does lots of backchord analysis, and he just with Kaleidoscope you can razz through a backchord 1,000 back calls in about an hour probably. Just go get an RSI in your index finger as you tap in the next screen.
15,000 a day.
15,000 a day. There we go.
That's why I look like this.
Cool. Rory in the middle.
With regards to the guide, are you wanting to put forward proposals as to what a long-term monitoring site network would look like? Or is this, yeah, I'm just wondering.
Again, I'll let Ollie chip in a minute. I think that's for other people probably to come up with a network. I think if we can provide the methods they can deploy across their sites, so either Jan on the Alters and Bob on sort of the National Nature Reserve network and stuff. If there is a method that their site managers, ecologists, whatever, can use and do that comprehensively and consistently across a range of different sites, across however many, 34? 37 of those, if they're all doing the same thing rather than different things based on particular focus on what they think is important on their site, then we can give them the Lego bricks, and then they can build in-house.
So do you have an idea of what constitutes a site?
What is one of your sites like, Bob?
Well, they range across 10 habitat types, and there are obviously multiples of those. They've been chosen as some of the best examples of the habitat type in the country, with a known history of management, so you can relate that to it. Generally, I mean, I'm not part of the LTMN, I only know of its existence, but this was all chosen about 8 years ago, and there's a whole load of criteria that the evidence lot went through. I'm afraid I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but they're geographically spread as well, obviously, not all clumped in one corner.
So across England and
I believe it's basically to try and represent the best examples of our own sites. You know, they are based on our own sites because we manage them, and therefore we have control over that, as opposed to Section 35 bodies that might own triple size or other sites. And some aspects have been taken over by the people now. So we did used to measure all the weather, but now that's been taken over by the Met Office. So it falls in with a national standardisation of measuring weather across the country.
Jan, would you like to just chip in on how, if there was a method put out there, how that might be deployed on your sort of locations on the Alter sites?
Well, I kind of agreed with your comment. What I want to know is how to do passive. I'll make up my mind where I'm going to be putting it, because it depends who's paying. No, seriously.
Yeah.
It depends who's paying for it. So I could go to a donor and say, okay, these really smart laddies have come up with this idea, and this is the equipment that we need. This is the kind of frequency that we're going to do. This is the kind of stuff that we need to know about, etc. And I want to do it in 17 sites in my place, and they turn around and say, yeah, right, you can do it too, because that's realistic. That's what's going to happen. But I'm really keen, and I was noting down your deadlines, because this Elter group is busy deciding now, as I said, as I showed you, and they're going to use the life plan, and I'm not necessarily against it. I haven't worked out what protocol is there yet. But if we have a good UK protocol, and I was thinking it won't be too different from the Oz one, the Australian one, I don't know. But we're needing an international one. So I'm really keen for you guys to get going. And then
I'll start plastic tomorrow. Might have a nap first. Yeah.
I was just going to say on site selection as well. So in Ireland, we're similarly looking up to set up the Elter sites, but it's all down to landowner permission as well. So like a lot of ours are privately owned lands, farmers or whatever. So we'll be kind of going to them in the first instance where we have good relations, and you have that annex habitat or a good habitat, and you're going from there.
Okay.
Sorry, just on the point of site, it's quite important. If you're talking about a long-term monitoring network, you need to think about what your sites are representative of. Like I think it's quite complicated, but like there's the question of you could go to a project, but then what is that project's sites representative of? Can you make statements about, biodiversity in England from that, or is it something more specific? So it's good to put some thought into like what you want your site network to look like. What is a site like? Is your site a kilometre square? And then how would you sample that kilometre square? How is it representative? There's like just questions.
Just coming back to you in terms, if I may, and then I'll let you come in. In terms of agri-environment, your sort of bag, one of the bags, the CEH and BTO have been involved in the developing monitoring methods, landscape scale, and applying that to look at different land use. And there is a method and research report underway that's using bats for that as a proxy for everything else that produces sound, perhaps, and general environmental quality. So in terms of agri-environment, what would you define as a site, and how, if there was a method coming out, how would you potentially deploy that?
I wasn't thinking with my agri-environment hat. I was thinking of having worked on developing the national pollinator monitoring framework as when I was a postdoc, and that was about achieving representation for a national scale monitoring scheme. And so we were thinking, okay, how do you select your 1 kilometre squares? How do you sample your 1 kilometre square? What methods do you use? How can you make it modular so that you can draw in different types of data? But from an agri-environment perspective, I mean, yeah, so the landscape scale species monitoring study, that's not published yet. I don't know what the results are, I've not seen, but I was also involved in the scoping study that designed the methodology for that. And we were, yeah, again, it was about how do you achieve a representative sample of sites with gradients of AES. So there's just thought has to go into that from with my agri-environment hat in Natural England. I mean, it depends on the question we're asking, because some of our questions are about the effectiveness of particular options. Some of them are at the holding scale, you know, the whole agreement, and then there's the big questions of, okay, what's the effects of agri-environment at landscape scale on biodiversity? So from like agri-environment research, yeah, we've got lots of questions, lots of scales that we're working across.
Yeah, and I think what your site is and whether you're a defined nature reserve or a plot of part of a national park or whatever, or if you're looking to deploy over a landscape to look at landscape effects, then your spatial deployment would obviously be different. But many other factors, probably if you're doing an eco-acoustic study in terms of sample rates, all the stuff we were looking at on the screen earlier, might be standardized across the whole of that, and you could use the same parts of the same methodology but just deployed differently depending on the spatial requirements from your scheme. Maybe. Thank you. Jan, were you going to chip in again?
Not really. I was just going to say that Mike Warcroft had set up the system that you were speaking about, Bob, and the site selection was a major issue, but it brings in all the points you were talking about. It depends on representativeness, etc. Yeah. And it ties in with what you're saying. You're still going to have to monitor and make up your mind how many minutes, etc. So I understand your guidelines will be telling me how many minutes and all of that kind of stuff. And it will be cost that decides on the selection of the criteria. I know Mike started with a lot more sites than your 37 that you ended up with, but you have to buy the toys, and somebody's got the purse strings. It's just brutally.
You can cost different scenarios as well. So that's something we did with the pollinator. We knew that cost was an issue, and we knew that there are lots of types of data we'd like to collect and collect at different frequencies and stuff. Yeah. So what you can do is create scenarios and say, well, if we sampled, this frequently at this many sites with this many recorders, this would give us this standard of data. We derive these metrics, and that's a good way of framing it. And then it can become a bit modular as well in terms of the people you use. Like which types of recorders are you using? Are you using volunteers to do it? If you are, then costs will be different, things like that.
Yeah, so great stuff. Cool. Any more? We're starting to run up to 4 o'clock, and I want to leave time for Mark to round the whole thing up at the end. Any more questions at the moment? Or I will just say one thing we had planned for today, possibly, but I've binned, was to develop some case studies and just say, if you were going to develop a protocol for this nature reserve, which is 100 hectares, and you want to focus on this, what would the protocol be? Or would the standard protocol be okay, or would you need to do something different? And I think perhaps within the guidance, as well as having the actual principles and rules, then some case studies of how that might be implemented on the example site. So if people have got potential case studies like national nature reserves or an alter site, etc., that we could maybe include a case study for and see how it might be deployed and costed, and that might be useful to include within the guidance as well.
Can I just say also, not only sites, but the consultancy world is here, and the laddies from the bank are here. Occasions like that as well that they might want. So I'm encouraging you to be case studies as well. And laddie is not a disrespectful term.
Cool. On that comment, I'm going to sort of slowly draw us to a close, leave that hanging, and we've got 10 minutes left for Mark to bid us all farewell. But anyway, thanks to the panel. Thank you all for questions.
It was open. So you can go back to it.
Yeah.
As long as you've got.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Any sound?
Okay, very good. Who is this man standing in front? My name is Mark Logarin. I'm from Bristol University.
Oh, Mark, sorry, would I ask you to stand here? Then the
Here,
people at home
and
can
I
also
like to
enjoy
stand
you.
in front of the microphone. And I happen to be the founder. Give me one of these. I happen to be the founder and coordinator of the Bioacoustic SIG, which is the official host here, but not the only funder. I'll talk about that in a minute. And I promise I'll be super swift. But just in case you don't realize, you can sign up to become a member of the Bioacoustic SIG, and I encourage you all to do this before you leave today, because this is one way how we can tell UKAN, who basically give us the money, and they have to report back to EPSRC, who fundamentally give us the money, that we are actually doing some good work. So please become a member if you are not yet, and tell your friends. What are we going to take away from here? I found these last 2 days super inspiring, and everybody here was probably brought here by a shared awareness of what a breakthrough time we are living in for acoustic monitoring. That's technology, that's analysis, and that's different levels of maturity in our different fields. So much of the last 2 days were integration action, where we try to talk to each other, understand each other, and close these massive gaps that you often have between fields. And that is really the remit of the UK acoustic networks, closing these gaps and bringing people together that usually you don't. And I haven't been here yesterday for the obvious reason that the university thinks I'm teaching a field course right now, so don't tell them. So the things that I want to take away is, first of all, what Ollie said earlier. Ollie gave a very good summary of what happened and what the aim was. So please support him in his guideline writing if you possibly can. We then have this initiative here by Alice. Some people have started contributing to this, and this is all about gathering some substantial work on what are the open questions, or what are the elements where we can create synergies from talking to each other where we usually don't. And that can be in the guidelines, but that can also be in producing new ideas, new initiatives. And that brings me to my almost final slide. Funding, future funding. So we are all here funded by one of these, a program grant by EPSRC. So UKAN and UKAN Plus are program grants. They are specifically designed, and let me read this. The program grants are a mechanism to provide flexible funding to world-leading research group to address significant major research challenges. So we can all feel smug because we are part of that. The second sentence is, they are intended to support world-leading researchers bringing together best with best teams to undertake a variety of activities focusing on one strategic research theme. I think this is just political speech for what we have been doing over these past 2 days. And what UKAN wants us to do is show or create momentum, that's their remit, but us as a SIG, or as all the different SIGs, show that we are not finishing this, or we are not ending this by the end of the funding, which will be in a few years' time. They want something that we set in motion that persists. And the best way forward, and we're encouraged to do this, is to start one of these program grants of our own. And we would have support from UKAN to do this. So this is a call to people here, people online, and your friends to just come and contact us. If you want to be involved in creating one of these big program grants, this is the time where we sit together and assemble a team and shape something that can fund us with quite some substantial funding over the years past UKAN Plus. So that's my call there. These are our funders, so a big thank you go to UKAN, in particular the Bioacoustic SIG and the Early Career SIG. Ollie is our early career representative in our SIG. We have all profited from the generous support by Manchester Metropolitan University, so big thank you to those. University of Sussex has also been very generous in supporting us today. And then we've got a long list of people who actually did the work. So we've got Finn, somebody told me how to pronounce it, but I can't. And Ginny, so big thank you to those. We've got our session chairs and co-organizers of this event in Alice, Carlos and Hugh. And then the biggest thank, without any doubt, goes to Ollie, without whose incessant work over the months past. None of what has happened over the past 2 days could have happened. So I think they all deserve a big hand. So thank you. And then I've got one final word, just in case nobody told you. You can register here. Thank you all for being here, for your contributions, and have a safe journey home.